What I decided I would talk about today, given the topic that you're all discussing, is how the UK fared in terms of the recent inflationary episode that we had. And if I could start with the slides, the first slide, please. So I wanted to just start with giving some background in terms of what the different experiences have been across the UK, the European Union, as well as the US in terms of the inflation episode, as well as sort of coming out both from the pandemic and the war. And just to give you a sense of how big this shock was, the first slide here shows you the how much household energy bills rose in the UK, the Euro area, and the US. And what you can see here is that the US is a very different context in this particular episode, with a fairly muted energy shock compared to, say, what happened in the Euro area or the UK. And the UK, of course, looks even worse than the euro area, and a large part of that has to do with the reliance that the UK has on different forms of energy, as well as the price setting system that exists in the country. What this translated into, of course, was household consumption being very weak in both the UK and the euro area compared to the US, which has seen this real resurgence in demand that came up after the pandemic. And if we look at sort of how much more the UK and the euro area look different from the US, is that you see this really sharp churn that happens after the pandemic in the US and much more muted sort of bounce back in the economy in the euro area and the UK. So, given this context of a much larger supply shock from the energy crisis in the UK and the euro area, as well as much weaker demand situation coming from household consumption and the bounce back from the pandemic, we really entered this cost of living crisis in a much, much weaker position than the rest of the world. So, next slide, please. What I'm going to show you now is to just sort of give you a bit more context from the point of view of the UK, and where possible, I'll try and sort of bring in some of the statistics that exist for the euro area as well. But broadly, the same kind of analysis has not necessarily been done everywhere. So I'm going to focus more on the UK, but hopefully it should give you a sense of how the findings translate to other regions as well. So this is the picture on your left is showing you different terms of trade crisis. So how much do incomes change relative to GDP in the UK over time? Of course, what you can see right at the very, very sharp drop that you can see in the 1970s is the big terms of trade crisis from the energy crisis in that era that happened in the which led to these really wage price spiral dynamics, as well as a very sharp period of unemployment in the 80s afterwards. What you see now in the much later episode in the late 2000, sorry, in 2022, as you can see here, is a much, much sharper drop in purchasing power. Again, not quite at the same level as the 1970s, but almost approaching that level. And one of the things that came out in this in early on in the debate over the cost of living crisis was that we were just in terms of our reliance on energy, that's only about 3.5%. But at the same time, the kind of terms of trade crisis we're seeing is really, really much bigger. In fact, almost at the same level as what we saw in the 1970s. So what I'm going to try and focus on in the pie chart is just show you what the basic consumption basket looks like. And that's the 3.6% number that you typically hear, that's how much households buy of energy in their consumption basket. And the 20.5% that you can see there is imports, while the blue purple picture, a bit of the pie chart, is domestic products. Next slide, please. What I'm going to argue is that if we want to get a sense of the supply side dynamics that went on during this period, as well as the global factors that were causing inflation, and a lot of it was imported inflation, we need to get a sense of how supply chains manifest themselves across the entire supply chain. So this is just to fix ideas. If you look at what happened to sliced white bread in the UK from 2022 to 2023, the price of it rose from 108 pence to 139 pence. So 30% increase in bread prices. Of course, that's not a trivial number, but what I want to point out is that one might think that that's something which is domestically generated inflation, because that's something that we buy at home. It's domestic producers and domestic suppliers that we buy bread from. But of course, going into bread making is the wheat coming from Ukraine largely, or the energy coming from Russia as well as Ukraine and other world markets. So at the end of the day, when you start counting how much is domestically generated inflation, how much is imported inflation, you can get very different answers depending on whether you take into account the supply chain or whether you don't. And why does that matter? Of course, we have a lot of direct control over domestically generated inflation, but not as much direct control over imported inflation. So the responses in terms of monetary policy as well as other policies are going to look very different depending on whether you construe these things to be domestically generated or whether you construe the 30% bread price inflation to be imported. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start looking at the consumption basket, but just to fix ideas with the sliced white bread, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's look at the price of a loaf of bread. I'm going to count up as much as I can all of the costs that we observe in terms of what goes into, the bakery that's making the bread. And everything else that I can't count, I'm just going to call that the profit margin of the bakery. Of course, this is not to say that this is necessarily profiteering. This could be going to pay other fixed costs of the business. But in as much as we don't observe what those costs can be attributed to, I'm going to call that profit margins, residual profits. And we can do the same thing along the supply chain from the bakery to the wheat flour mill to the electricity producer and so on and so forth, and start counting up every bit of bread making that's coming from imported sources versus domestic sources. So next slide, please. And once we do that, we can look at the entire consumption basket. And just to remind you, earlier I showed you a pie chart which said that 3.5% is what we buy of energy in the UK, what a typical household buys of energy. If you start counting up all of the stuff all of the energy that's going into bread making, which doesn't directly enter electricity bills, then what we end up with is a number for energy and other imports, which is of the order of 40% compared to a number which was a quarter. So instead of 25% being the broad number where we rely on global factors to supply us those commodities and services, we now end up with a number which is much bigger, almost of the range of 40%. So 40% of the consumption basket roughly in 2022 was stuff that was either coming from abroad directly or coming from abroad indirectly and embodied in domestic products that we were buying from our suppliers. And once we've taken this into account and we start looking at how much of the consumer price inflation in the UK was from domestic sources, which are the blue and the purples, which consist of wages, taxes domestically, as well as the profit margins or the gross operating surplus of businesses, and how much of it is imported inflation coming from imports as well as from energy, which is primarily determined in world markets, we end up with a much bigger orange and yellow bar you can see there compared to what you can see of the blue and purple. And what this is telling us is that, in fact, if I give you the summary number, 10.8 percentage points of the 16.8 percentage point rise in prices that had happened during this period was coming from imported inflation. A lot of the times this is not something new. People, of course, understand that there are these supply chain dynamics that go on, but many of the measures that we look at in central bank toolkits, as well as more broadly in macroeconomics, try and take this into account by looking at some other measures like core inflation, services inflation, core services inflation. And those are the numbers that have the bar charts that I've put on the right-hand side of the picture. And what you can see is that even if you focus on a relatively pure measure like core services, which strips out, things like airfares, which are very dependent on fuel, you still end up with a fairly substantial component of services inflation that comes from these global factors or these supply chain dynamics. Next slide, please. So this was showing you what happened in 2022. If you roll up to 2023, yes, the blue and purple, the domestically generated inflation goes up, largely coming from, wages rising during this period as a result of second round effects. But also, if we go even further to 2024, so next slide, please, you'll see that that number doesn't fully disappear. The yellows and oranges, even up till 2024, we see are pretty substantial. So about a third of the consumption basket was still experiencing inflation, which could be attributed directly to imported factors or global supply factors. So overall, the message I want to convey to you here is that when we start taking into account how much we depend on global forces and on supply side factors for inflation that's generated during these periods of really high inflation, the numbers are in fact much larger than what we would, summarize from very basic aggregate statistics. If you had done the same kind of analysis for the euro area, which there is a very recent ECB article about, it doesn't do it for imports, but as far as energy is concerned, the number goes up quite substantially in the euro area as well. So next slide, please. What I'm going to turn to now is just to summarize what I take to be key factors that come out, which is to say that global and supply side factors are key drivers of inflation anymore. But a lot of where monetary policy has typically focused has been on domestic and demand-driven price dynamics. And what has happened sort of in the last few years is that that very simple setting of demand and domestic factors leading to inflation has broken down. And instead, what we've seen more and more is global and supply side factors becoming resurgent again. As a result of that, the second sort of point that I want to make is that inflationary dynamics can differ a lot when they're coming from global factors and supply side factors as opposed to demand side factors. And why that matters is that a lot of the central bank modeling, as well as a lot of the data that we've developed over the years in statistical offices, is really focused on more on the demand side of it rather than on the supply side. It's still almost impossible to trace the supply chain carefully for even even a sort of handful of products in the consumption basket. So these techniques need to be developed a lot more, and that's going to help us understand what happens to inflationary dynamics in the future. The final thing I want to move to, the final point that I want to move to is that it's not just a matter of that we're lacking in terms of data and modeling tools to study these inflationary dynamics that come about as a result of global and supply side factors, but also that a lot of our toolkits that we rely on are much more effective at managing demand rather than managing supply side forces. And if going forwards, what we end up with is a situation where geopolitical divisions, or, in the last session, people talked about extreme weather events causing supply side concerns. If, for example, climate change causes those extreme weather events to become much more frequent and we don't keep up with the modeling and the instruments that are needed to address those sorts of inflationary dynamics, then we're really going to be facing more and more of these sorts of issues, the ones that we've seen in the post-pandemic period. And I think the key lesson that we should take from this cost of living crisis is that we need to be a lot more prepared with these situations of global and supply side management becoming more important, and our toolkits need to evolve alongside that as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But if you had any other thoughts, I'm very happy to hear them.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. Maybe I can open the floor to 2 or 3 questions. Maybe we can collect 2. How much time do you have? Maybe we can do 2 rounds of 2 questions, and then, if that's okay with you. Stan.
Anna Kolesnichenko, FEPS Foundation for European Progressive Studies. So the question is, what kind of tools and instruments to develop to manage supply shocks in the future? For example, I was a bit also researching on European Central Bank data, and I see, for example, that there is no profits monitoring proper. So the data comes from statistics office and with more than 1 year delayed and only annual. And I talked to ECB person and they said it's not in their capacity to develop that. But we know that in this particular, like it's last crisis, the profits were a major driver of inflation, and we as FEPS, we have a study on this, in particular for food supply chain, and we show that in trading, in maritime transportation, in fertilizers, everywhere, it was an issue with profits and speculation also. So as central bank, do you have any tools and ideas how to deal with that?
Thank Thank you. Maybe we can take a second question.
Yes, hello, my name is Stan Jordan, Sustainable Finance Lab. Thank you very much for the very limpid and great presentation. I wonder, is there, in a way, in reverse, is there a positive story about this in the sense that in the future, as we move towards renewable energy, can we already do we already have good indication or good evidence that the reverse can happen in the sense that with a larger share of renewable we will become less dependent on these imported goods and fuels, and therefore less inflation potentially. And I know that the Bank of Spain have done a bit of research, for example, on that, and they show that they increased the share of renewable by 30%, I think, since COVID, and their wholesale price in energy markets was down 50%, for example. So, but I wonder in the UK context, is the bank working on this kind of studies, and what's your understanding of that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those two questions. Over to you.
Perfect. So let me start with the first one. I almost feel like there were two questions in there, so I'll address them systematically. So one was this question of profits, and I think you're absolutely right in bringing that up for there's sort of two elements here. One is our ability to trace profits is actually very limited. Most data sources will give you some measure of profit, which is not exactly how we think of as economic profits. So there'll be either accounting profits in there, which make it very hard to tell one cost from another cost, what are capital costs and so on. So that's kind of one problem. And as far as I know, we end up hitting roadblocks on that very often. We did try to trace some of that, and I have in fact some work that tried to also look at food price inflation in particular. So notwithstanding that it's very hard to measure profits, we could at least look at what was happening in terms of changes in profits to see whether profiteering was another source of inflationary pressures. And at least at that point, when I looked at the food price inflation in the UK, you couldn't really find evidence that supermarkets were putting up their prices to make bigger margins. There wasn't really, at least going through every balance sheet that I could find of every major supermarket in the UK, that wasn't particularly the case. There's an element of that which you brought up, that what about in terms of fertilizer prices, that there was speculation going on, or that in terms of oil prices were somebody was at the fact that prices are rising, somebody at the end of the day is getting that price increase. And I think that becomes even harder to trace, because if these are in fact things that you're importing, where those profits are ending up, which country that's going to become almost impossible for an importing nation to be able to trace down. So I think those are really, really hard things to actually study, but I think they're very important. And, it'll eventually have to be up to the statistical agencies to be able to provide us with credible information on that. I don't think central banks are going to have the resources or the necessarily the expertise to develop those kinds of metrics. We can do some monitoring of that, but not much more than that. The second sort of point that you brought up was about what are the kinds of instruments that we would need. I think one instrument we've already seen a great example of, which is that when you have a massive energy shock like the kind we saw during this episode, central banks are not going to be able to react very quickly to that, because our tools take a lot of time to transmit. While what ended up happening was a lot of energy price caps or energy subsidies that were given to help households tide over the crisis. And I think that's something that we can have an honest conversation about, as to when are the times when those sorts of tools kick in and when they don't. And I think that's that's something which we need to be having as a society a very honest conversation about. Many other emerging markets, somebody brought this up in the context of Brazil in the last session, many emerging markets have dealt with these sorts of problems for a very long time, and they've thought about tools of all kinds, whether it's trade policy, securing trade partners and sources of supply, or whether it's about inventory management yourself, stocking up, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of sort of ideas out there. And, I'm not an expert on all of them, but hopefully those are things that we can have a conversation about. The second question was thinking a lot more about renewables and to what extent those might be one way that we may be able to sort of, stem the tide when it comes to these sorts of large shocks. And I think you're absolutely right, which is that alternative sources of supply become very important when you have this sort of a very, very sharp supply chain disruption, or a very sharp sort of severe strain on a few sources of supply. So in that sense, renewables provide one more sort of source of supply compared to sort of, say, the traditional sources of energy that we've become used to consuming. The bank's done a really sort of fairly pioneering, I would say, work. There's been a stream of work that's come out of the bank. Early on, it was looking at some of the transition risks that came up in the last session as well, but more and more the physical risks and the extreme weather events and how those matter for inflation. Those are things that we're starting to learn much more about. Up till now, I don't think we have a very strong way of saying that somehow access to renewables enabled us to curtail some of the inflationary pressures. I don't think that sort of evidence is strongly there. And if anything, some of the carbon price mechanisms, you might say, are pro-cyclical. So in that sense, that's something that I think we're going to learn much more about. And I wouldn't say I know very definitive research on the topic, but that's definitely something of great interest. And I hope I'll learn more about that as we progress.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple more questions. Jens, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks for this. Because the topic of this meeting is coordination, I wanted to ask you specifically about coordination between the Bank of England and the Competition Authority. Of course, the UK has very strong competition authority, and in the context of the sort of things you've been talking about, you might think that there's a role for coordinating interventions, but also investigations with the competition authority. We've seen this in Austria, for example, where the Austrian Central Bank and competition authority coordinated intervention. I was just wondering, do you see scope for that? Maybe there is already some coordination going on, and whether you would want to reflect on that as a way forward in future inflationary shocks.
Dominic?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dominic from New Economics Foundation here. Yeah, sort of an extension on that question as well, because when you were mentioning some of the sort of supply side response policies, obviously a few of them, like the Brazilian examples, for example, you wouldn't really be expecting a central bank to do. So I guess I wonder, what do you think is the role of the central bank in sort of demanding those policies, asking a government to do them, perhaps, thinking of unconventional monetary policies that can do the same job? Yeah, I just wondered what your perspective was there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Swati?
Great, thanks so much. Really difficult questions, and I don't want to be sort of evading them, but I think one of them I can answer, two of them I can answer with the same answer, really, which is that I always feel uncomfortable as somebody who is not an elected leader and as somebody who's gone through an appointment process instead, that I shouldn't be the one deciding what my remit is. I think that that's best left to elected officials. And in that sense, if they think that that coordination is needed, and if they think that there needs to be some other means of ensuring that different government departments and the central bank and other government departments talk to each other, I find that a much more comfortable space to be in. Now, that being said, of course, I don't think that you can operate completely independently in the sense of that you don't need to take account of each other's actions. We do take those into account, and I think there's sort of implicit coordination occurring, which is to say that we operated completely independently, and we were all looking at food price inflation and to what extent that was coming from different sources. The Competition and Markets Authority in the UK actually was completely independent of us, and we weren't, at least as far as I know, we weren't directly coordinating with them at all. But they were worried about food price inflation as well, and what the sources of food price inflation were, and to what extent there might be profiteering happening that may be increasing food prices even more than they should, you would expect them to rise. So they did their own independent investigation into it. And I think in some sense, that process worked well, even though there wasn't explicit coordination. So in that sense, I'm not convinced that there needs to be explicit coordination. But of course, there's a much bigger question which you've raised in the context of sort of the last question as well, which is who at the end of the day decides what's the role of central banks? Should they be demanding when policies kick in or when they don't kick in? I think we need some kind of a framework which delineates these responsibilities. I don't think I want to overstep my remit and start, going into those sorts of policy questions myself. So I think it's better done through a different, possibly, elected official side that actually starts to decide those things.
Thank you very, very much for joining us and giving us a very fascinating presentation and for the questions. Yeah, thank you very much.